started as a simple getaway. I'd booked a cabin up in the northern part of the state, tucked deep in the woods, at the end of a dirt road that barely showed up on the GPS. I just needed a few days alone. My phone had been blowing up for weeks. Work was a mess. My landlord was breathing down my neck about minor repairs, and I hadn't slept properly in over a month. I just wanted quiet. No emails, no neighbors, no traffic, no lights shining through the blinds. I didn't need luxury. I needed silence. The cabin wasn't much to look at from the outside. Just 4 walls, a slanted roof, and a small wooden deck with 2 old chairs facing the forest. Inside, there was a twin bed, a small table, a few chairs, a kitchenette with a tiny propane stove, and an old wood-burning stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. But it had running water and the toilet flushed, and most importantly, there was no cell service. That first night, the silence was almost overwhelming. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, where even your heartbeat feels loud. But I welcomed it. I cooked a basic meal, cracked open a beer, and sat on the deck until the sun disappeared completely and the black of the woods swallowed everything. I didn't see another soul for 2 days. The road leading in was a single lane of gravel and dirt, twisting between pine trees and overgrown shrubs. My car was parked about 20 yards away, just barely visible through the trees. I spent most of my time reading, scribbling in a notebook, and going on short hikes around the area. I stuck to the same path every time, out past the mossy boulders, across a shallow stream, and up a small ridge where the trees opened up enough for some sunlight to break through. Nothing strange happened. It was peaceful, exactly what I came for. Then, early on the 3rd morning, I woke up to the faint sound of movement outside. It was still dark, probably 5 in the morning. My first thought was deer. I'd seen droppings near the deck the day before, and there were broken branches that looked like something had pushed through. I stayed still and listened. There it was again, crunching leaves, slow and heavy. I got out of bed and walked quietly over to the window, pushing the curtain aside with 2 fingers. I couldn't see anything at first, just trees and darkness. But then I caught the faintest shape between the trunks, something moving low to the ground. It wasn't a deer. It was crawling, slowly. I stepped back and froze, my skin prickling. I couldn't explain it, but something felt off. It didn't feel like a person exactly, but it wasn't any animal I could name. It didn't make sense. I stood there for almost 5 minutes, breathing shallowly, listening. Whatever it was didn't come any closer. Eventually, the noise stopped altogether. When I worked up the nerve to open the door and check the deck, there was nothing there. But the leaves were disturbed in a wide trail, pushed to the sides like something had slithered or crawled through them. I tried to write it off as a raccoon or a bear, though I'd never seen a bear move like that. But it was enough to make me keep the hatchet from the woodpile inside with me that night. I kept it next to the bed and didn't sleep much. The next day, I decided to go farther out on the trail. I needed to see if there were signs of animals, tracks, scat, anything that could explain what I saw. About half a mile from the ridge, I found a small clearing where the grass had been flattened in odd shapes, like someone had rolled around there. There were branches snapped at low angles and a kind of pungent, musty smell that clung to everything. I crouched down and saw marks in the dirt. Not footprints, not really paw prints either, just wide, shallow depressions, spaced unevenly, as if something heavy with no real feet had dragged itself through. I turned back fast and didn't stop walking until I saw the cabin roof through the trees. I spent the rest of the day chopping firewood and pacing the deck. I didn't go back inside until dusk, and even then, I locked the door and braced a chair under the knob. I know how that sounds, paranoid, but something about the woods didn't feel right anymore. The silence had changed. It wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like the trees were holding their breath. That night, the noise came back. This time, it wasn't just leaves. It was tapping, sharp, steady taps on the wood siding of the cabin. I was in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The tapping started near the front door. Then it moved slowly around the side of the cabin. I sat up and listened, heart thudding in my chest. The hatchet was in my hand before I even realized I'd grabbed it. The tapping stopped, then started again beneath the window. I stayed still, barely breathing. I couldn't bring myself to look. I was afraid of what I might see. After a while, it stopped altogether and I waited. Minutes passed, then an hour. Eventually, the first light of morning came through the curtains. When I finally looked outside, there were deep scrapes in the wood beneath the window, 4 of them spaced apart like fingers. I wanted to leave that morning. I packed up, tossed everything into my duffel, and started carrying things to the car. I was almost done when I realized my keys weren't in my jacket pocket. I checked the duffel. Nothing. The kitchen counter. Still nothing. I turned the place upside down. No keys. I ran back to the car and looked through the windows. There they were, sitting on the passenger seat like I'd placed them there and locked the doors. But I never did that. I never lock the doors when I'm this far out. I had no choice. I couldn't break a window with just the hatchet without risking slicing the seats or hurting myself. So I went back to the cabin. The rest of that day passed slowly. Every sound made me jump. I didn't eat. I barely drank any water. I just sat on the bed, gripping the hatchet, staring at the door. At some point in the late afternoon, I noticed a faint buzzing sound. It wasn't from inside the cabin. It was outside, near the back. I pressed my ear to the wall and could just barely hear it. Like a hum, low and constant. I opened the back door slowly, stepped outside, and followed the sound. It was coming from the woods. About 30 feet from the cabin, I found an old tree with something hanging from one of the lower branches. It was a small device, maybe a wildlife camera, but it wasn't pointed at an animal trail. It was pointed at the cabin, and next to it, nailed into the tree, was a little box. I opened it carefully. Inside were batteries, wires, and a tiny speaker. That was the source of the buzzing. It was transmitting something. I turned it off and took it back with me. I didn't know what to do with it, so I tossed it into the wood stove and burned it. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat up in the corner of the cabin, facing the door, the hatchet across my lap. Hours passed. The woods stayed quiet, but at around 3 a.m., I saw movement through the crack in the curtain. A figure, not crawling this time, standing, just standing, not moving, maybe 15 feet away. Watching. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I just stared. It stayed there for maybe a minute. Then it turned and walked off into the trees. When morning came, I forced myself outside. There were no footprints, no signs anyone had stood there. Just the same disturbed leaves and a broken twig or two. I picked up a large rock and smashed the back window of the car. Took 2 hits. I climbed in, grabbed the keys, and drove away. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 3 towns away. I called a friend to explain what happened, and he told me I should report it. But report what? That someone had crawled around my cabin? That a weird box was nailed to a tree? I didn't even know who owned the land. Weeks went by, then months. I tried to forget about it, but it stayed with me. Every time I hear a branch snap outside my window, every time I wake up in the middle of the night and feel like I'm being watched. About a year later, I saw a story in a small regional newspaper about a missing person. A man had gone up to that same area, stayed in a different cabin a few miles from mine. He never came back. When the police searched the woods, they found a trail of disturbed leaves leading away from his cabin. No blood, no body, just drag marks. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I never will. I remember every second of that trip like it was pressed into my brain with a red-hot iron. At first, it was just meant to be a short weekend getaway with a few friends. 3 of us, all guys I'd known since college. We wanted something quiet, out of the way, where we could clear our heads. It was supposed to be fun. It wasn't. We booked the cabin in late October, a bit off-season, which made it cheaper. It was a small place up in the mountains, not far from the border of the state, surrounded by thick woods and dirt roads that stretched on for miles in all directions. The pictures online made it look rustic but cozy. Wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and a little lake not far behind the trees. The nearest town was about 45 minutes down a twisting road with almost no cell signal. That was the point. We wanted to unplug for a while, but we didn't realize how vulnerable that made us. We drove up in one car, loaded with gear, coolers full of food and beer, hiking boots, fishing rods, and a few duffel bags with warm clothes. The road up to the cabin turned to gravel after the last gas station. From there, it was nothing but trees and switchbacks. There weren't even signs, just coordinates the owner gave us and a laminated map. We got there around 4 p.m. on Friday. The sun was low, cutting through the trees in sharp beams that made the woods glow gold and orange. The cabin looked a little rougher in person. The paint on the window frames had chipped, and the front steps creaked loudly under our weight. The lockbox on the front door was rusted, and we had to fight with it to get the key out. Inside smelled like dry wood and old stone. The temperature was dropping fast, and there was no central heat, just an old wood stove and a pile of firewood stacked against the far wall. We got to work unpacking and getting the fire going. One guy sorted out food in the kitchen while another checked the back deck. I lit the first fire. The stove roared to life after a few minutes, and the metal creaked as it warmed. The first night was normal. We grilled meat on a little charcoal grill outside and drank beers until the cold drove us inside. There was no TV, just an old radio and a deck of cards. We played poker for a while, then sat around the fire and talked about work, women, and random memories from college. The wind picked up around midnight. It whistled against the walls, and branches tapped against the windows like fingers. I didn't sleep well. The wind never stopped, and I kept waking up to silence so complete it felt unnatural. The second day was when things started feeling wrong. We hiked after breakfast, heading toward the lake the map showed. The trail was barely marked, just a narrow path through brush and dead leaves. The trees were dense, pine mixed with bare birch. We walked maybe 2 miles and found the lake. It was smaller than expected, just a dark pool surrounded by mud and tangled roots. Still, it was peaceful. We sat there a while, skipped stones, and ate trail mix. On the way back, we heard a sound in the woods behind us. Just once. It was a hard cracking sound, like a heavy branch snapping. We all stopped and looked around, but the forest was quiet. I didn't think much of it at the time. Probably a deer. Maybe something larger, but still just an animal. That evening, one of us found boot prints around the back of the cabin. That got our attention. None of us had been out that way. The prints were fresh, not dried out, and clearly made by heavy-soled boots. Not hiking boots, work boots. They circled the back wall and disappeared into the woods behind the shed. We looked around the property for a while but didn't find anyone. Could have been a hunter, maybe someone from a nearby property. But we hadn't seen a single house or cabin on the way in, and we were miles off the main road. There was no reason for anyone to be walking around there. That night, we double-checked the doors and windows, shoved chairs under the handles just in case. It made me feel a little stupid, like I was being paranoid, but something about those prints didn't sit right. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to piss. The bathroom was tiny, with a small window that overlooked the back of the cabin. As I flushed and turned to leave, I noticed the curtain moving. Just a ripple, like it had been disturbed. I stopped and looked closer. The curtain was thin, and behind it was glass fogged up by the cold. But just before the fog blurred completely, I swear I saw the faint outline of a face. Just the top of a forehead, maybe eyes, level with the bottom of the window. It disappeared before I could be sure. I stood there for a long time, not moving, my heart thumping so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I didn't wake anyone. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want them to think I was losing it. I went back to bed, pulled the covers up, and stared at the ceiling until the light started bleeding in through the curtains. The next morning, the tracks were gone. It had rained lightly, just enough to smear the dirt. But something else had changed. Our cooler, the heavy-duty one we left on the back porch, was gone. Not moved. Gone. We searched the entire property, even down the hill behind the cabin, and never found it. That thing was too heavy for an animal to carry off, especially with the lid clipped shut. It had been taken. We packed up to leave that morning. Something about the air felt wrong. Thick, like we were being watched. We kept talking about how it was probably nothing, maybe some random drifter, but we didn't really believe it. The nearest town wasn't even a real town, just a gas station, a diner, and a couple of houses. It didn't add up. We loaded the car, slammed the trunk shut, and turned the key. Nothing. Dead. We tried again. Just clicking. Battery was shot. Maybe the cold, maybe we left something on. We opened the hood and found the battery cable had been cleanly cut. Not torn. Cut. That's when we all got quiet. We had no cell signal. No landline. No way to call for help. It was almost noon. We decided to walk the road back toward town. Figure someone would drive past eventually. We didn't talk much as we hiked. After about 3 hours, we saw a pickup coming down the road. It slowed as it approached, then stopped beside us. The driver was a man in his 60s, hard-looking, with sun-damaged skin and deep lines in his face. He asked if we were the ones staying in the cabin up the hill. We said yes. He didn't say anything else, just looked at each of us one by one. Then he offered us a ride. In the truck, he didn't say much. We asked him if there were other cabins around, anyone else living out that way. He said no, not for miles. We told him someone had cut our battery and walked around the place. He nodded but didn't seem surprised. Just told us we were lucky nothing worse had happened. At the gas station, we got a tow truck and had them haul the car into town. They said it would take a few days to get a replacement part and get it running. We got a cheap motel room and waited. Nobody wanted to go back to the cabin. On the second day in town, we saw a bulletin board near the diner. A few of the papers pinned there were old missing posters, mostly hikers, one guy in his 50s, 2 college girls from a couple years back. One of them had disappeared within a mile of where we'd stayed. We got out of that town the minute the car was fixed. Months later, one of the guys decided to report what happened. We hadn't really told the police the full story when we were there. We felt stupid. There was no proof of anything. No photos, no prints, just a battery cable and some boot tracks we didn't photograph. But he went ahead and made the report. They followed up with the property owner, who said nobody else had keys to the place. It had been listed for years, and nothing like that had ever happened before. But when they checked the shed, they found something we'd missed: scraps of food wrappers, beer cans, even a pair of work gloves and a folding knife shoved into a rusted toolbox. Someone had been using that shed, maybe sleeping there. The cops thought it was just a squatter or someone passing through, but that didn't explain the clean cut on the cable. It didn't explain the face at the window. We never went back to that cabin. None of us ever booked anything remote like that again. I haven't been camping since. I don't hike anymore either. I don't like being out where no one can hear you if something goes wrong. Out where the trees are so thick they swallow sound. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some legend or creature. It was just a person. A real person living out in those woods, close enough to hear us talking, to walk right up to the windows while we slept. Someone who didn't care that we were there. Someone who had probably done it before. And that's what haunts me most. Not what we saw, but what we didn't. I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of quiet dread that settled over me the moment I stepped onto that old porch. It was supposed to be a fun weekend trip. Just me and 2 of my oldest friends. We were all in our mid-30s, and life had taken its toll on our bonds. Everyone was busy, everyone was tired, so we decided to get away. Cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect place. Isolated, peaceful, no distractions. We could sit around, drink some beers, talk about old times, and hopefully find a little bit of that youthful freedom we'd lost somewhere along the way. We rented the cabin through a website, the kind you see all over the place when you're looking for a secluded weekend getaway. The pictures online didn't do it justice. It was more than just rustic. It was straight up ancient. The cabin had a rough wooden exterior, its edges softened by decades of wear. The surrounding trees were thick, casting long shadows across the property even in the middle of the afternoon. It was definitely a place that felt both inviting and ominous, but I brushed off that feeling when we arrived. After all, we were there to unwind. The drive up had been uneventful, though a little longer than we expected. The last few miles were nothing but dirt roads and overgrown bushes. I couldn't help but notice the lack of houses or signs of civilization. It was as though the world around us had stopped, and all that existed was the endless stretch of trees. The kind of place that might give a person pause, but I figured that was the point. It was supposed to be remote, quiet, We wanted to get away from everything, and we had. The cabin itself was tucked between a ridge of hills, almost hidden from view. The road was barely wide enough for our car, and the driveway was a collection of loose stones. When we stepped out of the car, the air felt thicker, colder. It was still autumn, but the leaves had already started to turn, and the wind carried a sharp chill. The trees seemed to be closing in around us, like they were watching. We got out and unloaded our bags. The cabin was a single-story structure with a sagging roof. The front porch creaked underfoot as we stepped up to the door, and the lockbox took a few tries before we could get it open. Inside, the place was surprisingly spacious, with a stone fireplace in the center of the living room and wide, exposed beams running across the ceiling. The furniture looked worn but sturdy, and there was an old rug in front of the fireplace. The kitchen was small but functional, and there were a couple of rooms off to the side. It was exactly what we needed. The first day went by like any other. We settled in, cracked open a few beers, and cooked some food. There wasn't much to do, but that was fine. We played cards, told stories, and sat by the fire as the night grew cold. I remember watching the flames dance in the hearth, the way they seemed to lick at the air as the room slowly filled with warmth. The night was quiet, too quiet, maybe. I didn't hear a single animal. No coyotes howling or wind rustling through the trees. But it didn't seem all that strange. We were deep in the woods, after all. Maybe the animals had already gone to bed. When I went to bed that night, I took one last look out the window. The porch light cast a faint glow on the trees outside, but beyond that, the darkness seemed endless. I went to sleep, the sounds of the crackling fire still echoing in my mind. But as I drifted off, I could swear I heard something. Something faint, a soft thud or scuffing noise from the porch. I couldn't make it out, and my mind brushed it aside as the wind. But I made sure to lock the door before closing my eyes. The next morning, I woke up early. The air outside was fresh and cool, and the sun was just beginning to rise. I got up to use the bathroom, then stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air. The ground was covered in leaves, the kind that crunched underfoot. It was eerily quiet, and for a moment, I wondered if maybe we had made a mistake in coming here. The thought passed quickly, but it still lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. We spent the day exploring the woods. There was a small trail leading through the trees, and we followed it for a while, but it eventually became too overgrown to keep going. By mid-afternoon, we were back at the cabin, laughing and joking about how we had already gotten lost on a trail that was barely a mile long. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, something changed. I don't know if it was the wind picking up or just a strange feeling in the air, but I felt watched. It was subtle at first, just the feeling of being observed, of someone standing just outside the circle of light cast by the porch. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, that it was just the isolation getting to me. But when I glanced out the window again, I saw something, a shadow standing just beyond the reach of the light. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing some sort of prank. But then the shadow moved, not in the way a person would. It was slow, deliberate, like it was studying the cabin. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It had to be an animal, maybe a deer or something larger. We were surrounded by woods, after all. But the feeling of unease wouldn't leave me. As the night went on, I kept hearing little noises outside, things scraping against the porch, soft thuds like something was moving just out of sight. It was after midnight when I decided to step outside. The night air was crisp, and my breath came out in little puffs. I tried to reassure myself as I walked toward the edge of the porch, looking out into the darkness. But all I could see were trees, thick and towering, and the faint light reflecting off the leaves. There was nothing there, no movement, just the silence of the woods. When I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were footprints on the porch. They were clear as day, fresh imprints in the dirt, and they were leading up to the door. The steps were large, heavy, like boots, and there were more than just one set. My first instinct was to wake up my friends, but I didn't. I told myself it was just some local who had wandered by, maybe someone who'd seen the lights and decided to investigate. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I told the others about the footprints. They laughed it off, thinking it was probably just some animal or maybe someone from the nearby area. But when we went to check the porch, they seemed to hesitate. They looked at the prints and the disturbed dirt, and suddenly the mood shifted. They weren't laughing anymore. We decided to stay another night, but the cabin no longer felt like the safe, peaceful retreat we had imagined. That night, things took a turn. I woke up to the sound of scratching against the walls. Slow, deliberate scratching. It was so faint at first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it got louder, closer. It was coming from the back of the cabin. I didn't want to wake my friends, but I couldn't ignore it. I crept out of bed and made my way to the window. There, in the distance, just beyond the light from the porch, I saw movement. A figure, a person standing still in the trees. I froze. My heart was in my throat, and every muscle in my body tensed. It wasn't one of my friends. I knew that much. Whoever it was, they were watching the cabin. I didn't move, not even when I heard the scraping sound again, this time from the roof. It sounded like claws dragging across the shingles. The fear that gripped me was primal, the kind of terror you only experience when you're completely vulnerable and exposed. I didn't sleep that night. When morning came, we packed up our things quickly. I didn't care about the food we had left behind, or the beers in the fridge, or anything else. I just wanted to leave. We didn't even say goodbye to the cabin, just piled into the car and drove off without a word. The drive back was silent, each of us lost in our thoughts. None of us spoke about what had happened the night before. The look in my friends' eyes said it all. They had felt it too. The fear, the realization that we had been watched, and that whatever had been out there, it wasn't going to stop. We never went back to that cabin. I don't know if anyone ever rented it again, but I know one thing for sure. There was something out there, something that didn't want us there. And I've never forgotten the feeling of being watched, of being so close to something that I couldn't explain, something real. And it still haunts me. I don't know why we decided to go hiking that day. It wasn't anything special, it wasn't part of any grand plan. We had been hiking for a few days, just a couple of friends wanting to get away from the daily grind, to spend a few days in the quiet of the mountains. No cell service, no distractions, just the forest, the trail, and the occasional campsite. We had heard the usual warnings about the area, warnings about getting lost, being unprepared, and the dangers of the wildlife. But I figured it was like any other hike, just another part of nature. We had been off the trail for a couple of hours when we stumbled upon it. It wasn't something we were looking for, but it was definitely something we found, and something we never should have. We were cutting through a dense thicket of trees, the kind that made the air thick and cool with moss. The path wasn't well trodden, and the foliage hung low, brushing against our faces and arms. We were following a faint trail that hadn't been marked in years, and though it wasn't difficult to follow, it wasn't clear where it led. We had been walking for a while, with no signs of other hikers or even animals, when we saw something strange up ahead. It was the silhouette of a building, almost hidden by the trees, its outline barely visible through the dense underbrush. At first, I thought it was just a mirage. The forest has a way of playing tricks on you when you're out there long enough. But as we got closer, it became clear. There was a cabin. It was old, maybe older than any of us had imagined. The wood was weathered, gray with age, and the roof sagged in places, as if it was barely holding on. There was no sign of life around it. No signs of recent use, no smoke from a chimney, no vehicles nearby. It was as though the cabin had been forgotten by the world and left to rot away. The front door was locked, but it wasn't just any lock. It was a heavy padlock, the kind you might see on an old barn or tool shed. A rusted, stubborn thing that would take some work to get through. We didn't have any tools with us, so we decided to look around the back. That's when we found the tree. It wasn't just any tree. It was enormous, its roots sprawling across the ground and pushing through the wooden planks of the cabin's back wall. The trunk had grown up through the roof, breaking through the rotting wood like a giant claw, splitting it wide open. The tree was so massive that it looked like it was holding the entire cabin together, as if the structure was dependent on its strength to stay standing. It was surreal, There's a kind of eerie beauty in seeing nature take over something man-made, but this was different. It wasn't just that the tree had grown into the cabin, it was that it had split the roof apart and now seemed to be holding it in place. As if something had intentionally left it there, or maybe something had happened to cause this. We stood there, frozen, staring up at it. The silence of the forest around us made everything seem still and heavy. It was then that I noticed something unusual. Embedded in the trunk of the tree was an old hunting knife, the blade shiny even in the dim light of the forest. The knife was partially buried in the wood, as though it had been jammed there on purpose. The handle was dark with age, but it was still recognizable as a hunting knife. My first thought was that it had been left there a long time ago, a forgotten tool from a previous hunter. But something about the placement, the way it was embedded so deeply in the trunk, made me feel uncomfortable. We spent a few minutes staring at the tree, unsure what to do. None of us really wanted to go inside the cabin. It seemed wrong, like trespassing in a place that didn't belong to us, but the curiosity was too strong. We were out here to explore, after all, to get away from the monotony. We decided to find a way in. Around the back of the cabin, there was a window, one of the panes cracked but still mostly intact. We managed to force it open, and I climbed through first, landing softly on the rotting floor inside. I could feel the weight of the cabin, the way the walls groaned as if they were about to collapse. The air smelled damp, heavy with mildew and age. I could hear the others behind me, squeezing through the window, careful not to break anything further. Inside, the cabin was much like I had expected. It was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. The furniture was rotted and broken. There were remnants of old chairs and tables, their legs warped with age, their upholstery decayed and torn. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and there were dark stains on the floor where the wood had swollen with moisture. It looked like no one had been inside in years. But then, as my flashlight swept across the room, I saw something that froze me in place. On the far wall, under what used to be a window, there were piles of old newspapers scattered on the floor. They looked ancient, the ink faded and the paper brittle with age. But it wasn't the newspapers themselves that made my blood run cold. It was the date on the top of the closest one. The year was 1997. The headline read, "Hiker missing in forest, last seen near old hunting cabin." I moved closer, kneeling down to pick up the paper. The article was detailed, too detailed. It told the story of a hiker who had gone missing near this very spot, last seen walking toward the old cabin. The article mentioned that search parties had combed the area for weeks, but no trace of the man had ever been found. His name was John Fielding. The paper went on to say that his disappearance remained a mystery, and that no one knew what had happened to him. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I flipped through the stack of papers, and there it was again. Another article, this time from a year later, saying that they had finally called off the search for John Fielding, concluding that he had likely gotten lost or met with some accident. But it was clear from the tone of the articles that they had no real answers. They had no idea what had happened to him. And the fact that he had been last seen near this cabin, it was too much to ignore. I stood up, the paper in my hands feeling like it was burning me. The others had come over by now, looking at the papers too, but no one said anything. We didn't need to. We all felt the weight of what we had discovered. And then I saw something else. Tucked in the corner of the room was a small wooden chest. It was old, just like everything else in the cabin, but it wasn't rotting away like the furniture. It was still intact, the wood sturdy, though it had clearly been neglected for years. I felt drawn to it, almost as if something was urging me to open it. But I hesitated. Something about the cabin had changed since we'd entered. The air had shifted, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't supposed to be here, that opening that chest might lead to something we weren't ready to face. But curiosity won out. I walked over to the chest and kneeled in front of it. My hands shook as I reached for the latch. It opened with a soft creak, and inside, I found only a few objects. A small bundle of clothing, stained with something I couldn't identify, a broken flashlight, and a dirty, torn map of the forest. But there was one more thing, a photo. It was a black and white picture of a man, standing near the edge of a forest. He looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. His expression was serious, almost grim, and in the background, the same cabin from the photo was barely visible through the trees. The edges of the photo were worn, and there was something strange about it. The man's face was scratched out, as if someone had intentionally erased him from the picture. I stood up quickly, a chill running down my spine. The silence in the cabin had deepened, and I could hear the wind rustling outside, the creaking of the walls as they shifted under the weight of time. We weren't alone in this cabin. The memory of John Fielding was still here, and whatever had happened to him was still tied to this place. We left soon after that. We didn't speak much on the way back to the trail, but none of us could shake the feeling that we had uncovered something we shouldn't have. We had ventured too deep, and what we found in that cabin was something that should have remained hidden. Something that, in the end, might never be explained. We never went back. I don't know what happened to John Fielding, but I don't need to. Whatever happened, it's clear that the cabin had been a part of it. And now, it's just another part of the forest's forgotten history. Lost, hidden away, waiting for the next hikers to find it. It was late October when I first heard about the missing hunters. I was at a hardware store in Klamath Falls picking up some supplies, nothing out of the ordinary. I needed some new steel traps, heavy-duty rope, and a couple propane tanks. A man at the counter was talking to someone else about how 4 men had vanished up near the Fremont-Winema National Forest. I didn't think much of it. You hear things like that every year around hunting season. Someone gets lost, maybe gets drunk, maybe even runs into a cougar. But this story didn't fade like most do. I'm a trapper by trade, mostly out in the deeper backwoods, where nobody hikes anymore. I keep a low profile. I've got my own cabin way off the grid, and I don't go into town unless I absolutely have to. People out here know me, but not well. That's how I like it. A couple weeks after hearing that story, I was up in the hills checking my line west of Gearhart Mountain when I came across something odd. Not the boot, at least not yet. First, it was the silence. It was the kind that creeps up on you. The woods were still, even the birds weren't making noise. That's always a bad sign. The air was cold and the ground wet from several days of rain. My boots were soaked, and everything smelled like mold and pine. I had my usual route, a loop that takes a day and a half to walk. I'd stayed overnight in a makeshift lean-to I'd built months earlier. The traps had caught a few things, but half of them were empty and tripped, which was strange. Something had been going through, not taking the bait, but still setting them off. Late the second day, I was hiking back toward my base when I noticed a game trail I didn't recognize. It was faint, like it hadn't been used in years, but I could tell something heavy had moved through recently. I followed it for a while, curiosity getting the best of me. After about a mile, I found a clearing that wasn't on any map I had. Right at the edge of it, near a rotting log, was a boot. It was brown leather, old but well made, still laced tight. The leather had water damage, but the shape was still solid. I got closer and realized it wasn't empty. Inside was a foot, bone, and tendon still held together by the boot's tight structure. It didn't even smell much, which told me it had been there a long time, maybe frozen at some point. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it for a while. The laces were still done up tight. No signs of a struggle. Just a foot, clean cut, like the leg had been taken off surgically. Not torn, not chewed, just gone. I marked the location mentally and backed out the way I came, my eyes scanning the tree line the entire time. Back at my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I didn't tell anyone at first. I've learned the hard way that law enforcement around here doesn't take well to people like me. They think of us as relics or outlaws. I was also afraid they'd come out and start snooping around, and I didn't want anyone that deep in my area. But the boot, it gnawed at me. I remembered the story from the hardware store. For men, all experienced hunters. They were staying in an old cabin in the woods, had all the gear, enough food to last weeks. Then one day, no sign of them. No signs of a break-in, no signs of struggle. Their rifles were still in the cabin. Even their packs and coats were hanging inside. The only thing missing was the men. Over the next few weeks, I started asking around, quietly. I found out more than I expected. The cabin was old, probably from the 1930s or 40s. Used by a logging crew back in the day. then handed down over the years. It was off a decommissioned fire road, hard to reach even with a solid truck. Supposedly, it had been empty for decades until someone fixed it up enough to use for hunting season. One of the men who vanished, a guy named Mark, had posted a few photos on a forum before they went out. That's how I found the location, based on a landmark in the background of one shot. I realized it wasn't far from where I'd found the boot, so I went. I waited until late November, after the snow had started but before it got too deep. I took my snowshoes and enough supplies to last 3 days. It took most of one full day to reach the area. I had to hike the last couple miles after the road ended, dragging a sled with my gear. The cabin was there, just like in the photo. It sat low in a basin between ridges, hidden by trees. A small creek had frozen over behind it. From the outside, it looked fine. Solid logs, tin roof, stone chimney. But when I stepped inside, it felt wrong. Not spooky, just wrong. There were 4 cots, for packs. Food still on the shelves, clean and dry. A coffee pot sat on the stove. The rifles were leaned in the corner, all of them with dust on the barrels. I ran my hand over one, cold, undisturbed. Even the stove was clean, no ash. They hadn't even lit a fire the night they left. I found nothing out of place except the silence. That same silence I'd felt in the woods before. Felt like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed the night. I lit a fire just to see if the chimney worked. It did. I boiled water and tried to sleep, but my nerves were too frayed. Every little sound set me off. Branches cracking, wind. One time I thought I heard something like a cough, but it could have been anything. I left just after first light. I didn't want to be there any longer than I had to be. Over the next month, I returned 2 more times. The second trip, I explored further out, trying to trace where the men might have gone. I found tracks, faint ones, half melted and frozen again. They went north for about half a mile, then vanished. No signs of a scuffle, no animal tracks, no drag marks, just gone. The third trip was when I found more. This time I brought a metal detector just in case. I found a belt buckle deep in the woods, rusted and half buried in moss. Nearby, I found a shotgun shell, not fired, just sitting on the ground, wet and cold. It was from one of the same brands the hunters had in the cabin. Still no bodies, still no signs of what happened. But then I found something that made me stop going back. It was a small, shallow depression in the ground. Looked natural at first. Then I noticed the trees around it. They were cut, not broken. Clean cuts, but not with a chainsaw. Something sharper, something manual. I found bones. They weren't scattered like a predator would leave them. They were arranged. A few ribs, a hand, just the bones. Clean, sun-bleached. I didn't touch them, but I knew. These weren't animal remains. They were human. I went back to town after that.
Kvietli I kontakted av man I Trusted.
He used to be Forest Service, now retired. I gave him the location and what I'd found. He went out with a team the next week. They shut the area down after that. Said it was too dangerous, risk of old mine shafts, unstable terrain. Nobody asked me any questions and I didn't push it. But the papers ran a story a few months later, talked about partial remains, mentioned weather exposure, and said it was likely the missing hunters. But I know what I saw. It wasn't all of them, maybe not even 2. They never mentioned the boot, never mentioned the foot, and they never said what cut the leg so clean. I've never gone back to that part of the forest. I moved my lines further west, closer to the state line. I don't talk about it much, and I sleep light now with my rifle close. But some nights, when the wind is still and the woods are quiet in that same unnatural way, I remember the boot, still laced, still standing straight, and I wonder what they saw out there, what made for armed, experienced men walk out into the cold woods and never come back. No fire,
Nogir.
no sign of struggle, just silence and bones. It was early September when I first heard about the murders. I had been planning a solo trip to the mountains, hoping to get away from the noise of the city and spend a few weeks in isolation. My job allowed remote work, and the idea of working with a view of pine trees and a wood-burning stove instead of fluorescent lights and traffic was too good to pass up. The cabin I found was listed as private, nestled deep in a remote area of Northern California, near the Oregon border. It was cheap too, which should have raised a red flag. But the photos looked decent, and the owner said there was good satellite internet and plenty of firewood. I paid for 3 weeks up front. The road there was bad. Gravel turned to dirt, and dirt turned to little more than a footpath. It had rained a few days before, and the narrow path was slick, my tires skidding more than once. I passed through stretches of thick forest where the trees seemed to close in, branches scraping the sides of my truck. After 2 hours of driving off the main road, I arrived. The cabin was small, old, and sat alone in a small clearing surrounded by tall trees. The nearest neighbor was supposedly half a mile away, but I never saw another house. There was a narrow creek behind the cabin and what looked like an old fire pit out front. The air was cold and smelled like wet pine. Inside, the cabin was rustic but had all the basics. There was a wood-burning stove, a table, 2 chairs, a single bed, and a loft that could sleep another 2 or 3 people if you didn't mind the low ceiling. The kitchen was just a propane stove and a sink with a water pump. No fridge, no TV. The kind of place meant for people who wanted to disconnect. I liked it immediately. The first few days were peaceful. I'd work in the mornings, hike in the afternoons, and spend the evenings reading by the fire. The nights were dead quiet. I didn't realize how much noise surrounded my daily life until it was gone. No sirens, no honking, no distant hum of traffic. Just wind in the trees and the occasional owl. It was on the 4th night that I stumbled on something strange. I had been hiking along the creek, going further than I had before, when I noticed a gap in the trees. The terrain dipped slightly, and the trees opened to reveal a second, smaller cabin, older and partially collapsed. It didn't show on any of the maps I had checked before. The roof had fallen in on one side, and the door hung open. The grass around it was waist-high, no recent signs of life. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I approached carefully, not out of fear but caution. Sometimes old cabins like that are used by squatters or drifters, but it was empty. Inside, the floorboards were warped, and the furniture was covered in mold. There was a couch that looked like it had exploded from the inside out, stuffing scattered across the room. A broken table lay on its side. On the far wall, there were still pictures hanging. Faded photographs of a family. A woman, 2 boys, and a younger girl. They looked like they were from the 1990s. One of the pictures had the corner burned, like someone had tried to destroy it but changed their mind halfway through. I didn't stay long. The place felt wrong. Not haunted, just off. Like a place where bad things had happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had picked up, and branches scraped the roof. I kept thinking about the photos on the wall and why someone had left them behind. The next day, curiosity got the best of me. I drove into town, which was about 45 minutes down the mountain, and stopped at the local library. I asked if they had any old records about properties up in that part of the woods. The librarian, a woman in her 60s, looked at me strangely when I described the area. She pulled out a thin folder and said there was only one report she could find, but that the place I described sounded a lot like the old Redman property. I read the article right there at the counter. In 2002, a woman named Carla Redman, her son James, and his friend Brandon were found murdered in their family cabin. The bodies were discovered by a search party 3 days after a neighbor reported that something smelled wrong. The mother had been tied to a chair and tortured. Her son and his friend had been beaten to death. Blood was found throughout the cabin. The daughter, a girl named Leah, was missing. At first, they thought she'd been kidnapped, but there was no ransom, no messages, nothing. For nearly 5 years, there were no answers. Then, in 2007, a hunter found her remains about a quarter mile from the cabin.
Shallow grave.
Her bones showed signs of trauma. She had been beaten like the others. It was one of the most brutal and mysterious murders in that part of the country. And to this day, no one had been arrested. No fingerprints, no DNA.
No witnesses.
And what made it even stranger was that there had been several other cabins nearby, but nobody reported hearing anything that night. Not a scream, not a gunshot, nothing. I stared at the article for a long time. The librarian said it was one of the reasons cabins in that area were cheap now. People didn't want to be near something like that. I thanked her, got in my truck, and drove back up the mountain. Halfway there, I had to pull over. I was shaking. The photos on the wall, the woman and the girl. I had seen their faces less than 24 hours ago. I had stood in the room where it happened, and I hadn't known. Back at the cabin, I sat outside for a long time. The air felt colder. I kept thinking about how close I had come to that old crime scene without realizing it. I didn't sleep well. Every little creak of the cabin sounded louder than it should have. I kept hearing things. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. But when I looked outside, there was nothing. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Not an animal. These were steady, deliberate, human. I stayed in bed, not moving, holding my breath. The footsteps came closer, stopped outside the cabin. I heard the porch boards creak, then nothing. I waited, maybe an hour, before I got up and looked outside. There were faint impressions in the dirt.
Bootprints.
Not mine. The next morning, I followed them for a bit. They led toward the old Redmen cabin, then disappeared in the underbrush. That was enough for me. I packed my gear, locked the cabin, and drove back into town. I didn't say anything to anyone. I just left. A month later, I read that a new investigation had been opened. Someone found a buried canister behind the Redmen cabin while hiking, full of photographs. Dozens of them, all from the 1990s and early 2000s. Some showed the Redmen family smiling. Others were different. Photos taken through windows. Photos of the cabin at night. Someone had been watching them for a long time. The FBI got involved. They linked the photos to a man who had once worked maintenance in the area. He had died years earlier in a car crash, but when they searched his old property, they found more photos. Journals, maps. He had watched the Redmen family for over a year. He knew their schedules, knew when the neighboring cabins would be empty, knew when the power lines would go out. The night of the murders, there had been an outage. No lights, no phones. He had waited for the perfect night. The FBI couldn't say exactly what happened inside the cabin that night, but based on the evidence, they believe he tied up the mother and forced the boys to watch as he tortured her. Then he killed them. Leah had run. They think he caught her later. The journals didn't say why. No motive, just that he wanted to see what people looked like when they lost hope. The case was finally closed. 23 years later, I never went back to that cabin. I still think about it sometimes, how I walked into that old scene of horror without knowing. How I slept just a few hundred yards from where that nightmare happened. How I never heard a thing that night when someone walked up to my door. Sometimes evil doesn't look like monsters or ghosts. Sometimes it looks like an empty cabin in the woods, and silence. I was always drawn to quiet places, especially the kind most people don't bother visiting anymore. That's why I got into wildlife photography in the first place. It wasn't about the photos, not really. It was about the waiting, the stillness, the subtle shifts in nature most people never noticed. You had to be patient, sit for hours in the brush, sometimes still enough to feel your heartbeat in your hands. That's the kind of life I built for myself. Quiet, observant, solitary. A buddy of mine from the Forestry Service had told me about an old cabin deep in the backcountry of British Columbia. Said it was barely used anymore, still technically maintained, but too far out for most hikers to care. No road in, no signal, no power. Just a roof, a stove, and a view. That's all I needed. I planned the trip out for a couple months. I packed all my gear, 3 cameras, a few wildlife cams, extra batteries, enough food for 3 weeks, backup chargers, logbooks, fire starting kits, first aid, a compact solar panel for light charging, everything I could need. I left my route with a couple of people, my brother included. Told them I'd check in when I got back, no signal expected. They knew the drill. I'd done solo runs before, though not this deep. The hike took me 2 days. The trail was overgrown past the first 5 miles. I lost the markers more than once and had to backtrack with my compass. I reached the cabin late on the second day. It sat in a small clearing near the base of a slope, surrounded by heavy pine forest. The clearing wasn't wide, maybe 40 feet across, but the trees around it were thick and tall, towering, the kind of trees that blocked out the sun even in the middle of the day. You could feel the weight of them pressing down on the air. The cabin was small, maybe 20 feet by 15. Log construction, one room with a cot, a stove, and a workbench by the window. No door lock, just a latch. It smelled like old pine sap and mold. There was a water source 100 yards out, an old pump well, rusted but functional. That night, I ate cold beans straight from the can and set up one of the cameras by the clearing's edge. Kept a log. I always do on these trips. Simple entries. Date, weather, animal sightings, gear check, sleep quality, any issues. Weather cold, damp, light drizzle. No signs of animals yet. Set up 2 cams. One facing north, one west. Cabin in good shape. Stove working. Feeling good. The first week was quiet. I saw deer early on, and a black bear far off through the trees. The forest was unusually silent, though. I noticed that more and more. Not that there weren't any animals, it was more like they moved differently. They kept to the edges, just out of range. My cameras caught glimpses. Eyes in the brush. Movement in the dark. Nothing conclusive. Still, I was happy. The air was clean. Nights were dead silent except for the wind in the trees. Weather clearer. Cold snap at night. Woke to frost on the ground. One of the cams picked up something. Shape in the trees. Might have been a moose. Too blurry to tell. Re-angled camera west. Hearing snapping sounds near the tree line at night. Could be wind. Could be anything. On the 6th day, I started waking up to find the ground disturbed outside the cabin. Nothing major, just overturned dirt. Once, a small pile of stones near the steps. Another time, fresh claw marks on a tree nearby. I assumed it was a raccoon or something nesting under the cabin. I knocked around underneath but didn't find anything. No burrow, no smell, nothing. By the second week, the unease had started to build. I wasn't sleeping well. I'd wake up sweating, listening, not sure why. There were no obvious signs of threat, but I couldn't shake the sense of being watched. Not watched by an animal, watched like how you feel when someone stares too long at you in public. That weird sense of attention that makes your skin crawl. I kept checking my cameras. The wildlife cams would show movement in the brush, just at the edge of the light. Shapes, still frames of something tall, sometimes crouched. I assumed it was a bear. The problem was the shapes weren't consistent. Sometimes they were wider, sometimes too thin. No sun today. Sky just gray all day long. Camera 3 picked up movement again. Something standing still at the edge of the clearing for 3 hours. No sound, no approach. Checked prints, none found. Tried to sharpen the stills but couldn't get anything clearer. Sleeping worse. That night, I woke up at 3:12 a.m. I remember the time because I checked my watch when I sat up. I hadn't heard anything. I just woke up suddenly, heart pounding. The kind of panic that feels like it doesn't belong to anything. I stayed still for maybe 10 minutes. Then I got up and looked out the front window. I couldn't see anything at first. Just the outline of the clearing under a sliver of moonlight. Then I noticed a shape, darker than the trees, standing just inside the tree line. Not moving, not hiding either, just standing. I didn't go outside. I just stared at it, barely breathing. I counted 30 seconds, then a minute. Then I went back to the cot and sat down. When I looked again 5 minutes later, it was gone. Didn't sleep. Reviewed cam footage. Nothing on the south or west cameras. Re-aimed one to face cabin. Going to keep one watching me now. Trying to stay logical. Might be a camper or poacher. But why would they stay hidden? That day I walked the perimeter. Took my knife and one of the trail cams. Tried to find any trace of someone walking through.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No wrappers, no gear, no smell of smoke or fire. I left a cam pointed low to catch movement and another high to watch the clearing overnight. The footage from that night showed me sitting in the cabin through the window. Then at 2:43 a.m., something entered the frame. A figure, very tall, maybe 6.5 feet. Could have been a guy in a jacket, but it looked wrong. The shoulders were hunched too high, and the arms too long. It didn't come any closer, just stood there for nearly 20 minutes. Then it walked back into the trees. The face was never clear. Wind picked up, trees moving harder, getting harder to focus. Watched the footage again. Something is wrong. I don't know what. It's not a person. I don't think it is. Who would just stand there, not come closer, not leave tracks? I started talking out loud, not to anything or anyone, just to fill the silence. I'd read about people doing that when they got too isolated. You do it to hear something, to prove you're still there. That night, I moved the cot in front of the door and slept with the hatchet in my hand. I heard movement just after 3 a.m. Branches cracking, footsteps soft but deliberate. The kind you hear from someone not trying to be quiet, but not in a rush either. Then tapping, light, tap, tap, on the far wall, the one without windows. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, I just listened. Tap, tap, then nothing. Something came right up to the cabin, tapped on the wall. No prints, no signs. It knows I'm here. It's not scared. I think it's watching me during the day. I don't know what it wants. That day I reviewed the most recent footage. Nothing, no movement, no figure, just trees. And then in the last frame, right before the battery died, I saw it. A portion of something reflected in the cabin's window. Close, like it had been standing just to the side, watching me inside. I didn't go outside that night. I blocked the door. I doused the fire early. I laid down and just stared at the ceiling, listening. That's the last page in the logbook. When the search team hiked in 2 weeks later, they found the cabin intact. His gear was still inside. The cot had been moved back. His camera equipment was arranged neatly on the bench. Nothing was broken. Nothing was stolen. Food supplies were still there. His pack was hanging by the door, hatchet still in its loop. But no sign of him. The cameras still had power. The main one, the one he'd set up pointing toward the clearing, was full. Mostly trees, mostly nothing. Until the last few shots. The final sequence showed the front of the cabin. It was daylight, maybe late afternoon. In one of the last frames, you can see part of something at the far left. Just the edge of a figure. A foot, maybe. A calf. Jeans or something like it. Just standing, facing the cabin. The next image is from a few minutes later. The figure is gone. That was the last shot. They searched for a week. Dogs, drones, no trail, no body, no clothes, no gear, no blood, nothing. It was as if he just walked out into the trees and never came back.